I found her sitting in my workshop recliner with her shoes off, drinking my coffee, and scrolling through Pinterest on her iPad like she was in a damn Airbnb. I blinked twice, thinking maybe I'd accidentally wandered into someone else's shed, but no. It was mine. My tools, my bikes, my workbench. And there she was, Karen, vice president of the HOA from 3 streets over, acting like the queen of a place she had no business even knowing existed. When I asked her what the hell she was doing in my private workspace, she smiled like a mall Santa and said, "Oh, just checking on the property. You know, the HOA believes this space might actually fall under community maintenance." Then she kicked her feet up on my vintage Harley frame like it was a folding ottoman and took another sip. I should have called the cops. Instead, I built a wall around her. It all started with a gate. Not a metaphorical one, a real, solid gate I installed 3 months back at the far end of my property. My place sits on the edge of the neighborhood, technically grandfathered in before the HOA took over the surrounding lot. That meant, legally, I wasn't part of their little empire. But that didn't stop them from trying. The gate was my first act of quiet rebellion. I was tired of joggers cutting through my driveway, tired of the HOA sending letters about the color of my barn, and definitely tired of Karen's clipboard patrols every Saturday morning. So I installed a keypad-locked gate with a sign that read "Private Property. Do not enter." Naturally, this drove Karen insane. At first, she tried subtle pressure. Notes in my mailbox. Friendly visits where she'd pretend to care about my workshop renovations. Then came the official notices, none of which applied to me. I ignored them all, assuming that eventually she'd give up and go harass someone's rose bushes. Instead, she found a side path through the woods behind my place, and let herself in through my unlocked back door one sunny morning like she was dropping by for brunch. I'd gone out for coffee and donuts that day, expecting a peaceful morning of sanding down a 1971 Norton Commando. I came back, box of glazed donuts in hand, and nearly dropped them when I saw Karen curled up in my recliner. The worst part wasn't even the trespassing. It was the way she acted like I was the rude one. She motioned to the box in my hand and said, "Oh, I hope you brought enough for both of us." I didn't laugh. I just stared at her, waiting for her to get up and leave. She didn't. I calmly told her that this was private property and she had no right to be here. She tilted her head and said, "Actually, we're still determining that. The HOA legal team is reviewing some records that suggest this building was once listed as a utility structure for the development. That means it may be shared space." My blood pressure went up about 20 points, but I kept my voice level. The building had never belonged to the HOA. It was built by my grandfather before the HOA even existed, and it sat squarely within my property lines. I had the deeds, the surveys, even the blueprints. But Karen wasn't interested in facts. She was interested in conquest. She stood up and began pointing at things like she was a real estate agent showing off a rental. "That window's cracked. That bench isn't OSHA compliant. This area should really be locked up if you're not using it." She even had the nerve to suggest I might need to allow HOA board members access during off hours in case of emergencies. I asked her what kind of emergencies required them to use my welder or sit in my recliner. She didn't have an answer. She just smiled, that same smug, power-drunk smile she always wore during HOA meetings. At that point, I told her flat out to leave. No more warnings. No more discussions. Just get out. Her smile faded, replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. She crossed her arms and sat back down, saying she wasn't going anywhere until the HOA sorted it out. I walked outside to cool off. I considered calling the police, but then pictured the conversation. She'd just cry, claim she thought it was public space, maybe even accuse me of being aggressive. No. I needed a solution she couldn't talk her way out of. And then it hit me. I pulled out my phone and texted Dave. "You still got that leftover brick from the pool house job? Bring it. And a cement mixer." He responded with a thumbs up and a laughing emoji, then added, "You want me to ask questions now or later?" I said later. Dave and I go way back. He's the kind of guy who doesn't need a lot of context when it comes to petty revenge. We built a chicken coop shaped like a tank once just to irritate a neighbor who complained about the noise. He owed me one for helping him hide the damage after he accidentally drove his skid steer into his brother-in-law's boat. Now it was time for him to return the favor. That afternoon, while Karen was still lounging in my recliner and making calls to her HOA minions, we started measuring. I made a point of not saying another word to her. I didn't want a confrontation, I wanted results. We took the front portion of the workshop, just beyond the main door, and marked off a clean, straight line about 4 feet behind it. We were going to build a brand new wall, sealing off the front of the workshop completely. The idea was simple: leave Karen inside a small but livable space, cots, power outlets, snacks from the emergency kit, and build a proper brick wall so that, from the outside, it looked like nothing had changed. I had cameras rolling the whole time. I wanted documentation. Dave was chuckling the entire time, laying mortar like we were building the Great Wall of Stupid. Karen noticed sometime around the second row of bricks, looked up from her iPad, and said, "What are you doing?" I replied with a calm, "Just making some adjustments." She scoffed and went back to scrolling. By nightfall, the job was done. We left a small ventilation opening near the ceiling, made sure she had water, and installed a peephole just for fun. Then we sealed up the outer door and stood back to admire our work. From the street, it looked like nothing had happened. From the inside, Karen was now technically a guest in a one-room minimalist prison of her own making. I left a note by the vent. "You wanted to stay. Enjoy. I'll check on you tomorrow." That night, I cracked open a beer, put my feet up, and watched the security footage of her realization on loop. She didn't scream at first. She didn't panic. She paced. She called someone. Then she tried the door, found it solid, and began yelling. I muted the footage. It was more peaceful that way. Tomorrow, I knew the cops would probably come. But I also knew they'd see the footage, the documents, and the sheer ridiculousness of what she'd done. And if they didn't? Well, I had another plan. But that comes later. For now, Karen wanted to claim my space. So I gave it to her. Brick by brick. I woke up the next morning feeling like I'd just won a quiet war. The kind of war where your enemy was armed with an iPad and self-importance, and you were armed with bricks, blueprints, and a sense of humor sharpened by years of HOA nonsense. I made myself a strong coffee, grabbed a granola bar, and strolled over to the workshop with all the calm of a man checking on a Sunday crossword puzzle. Sure enough, through the tiny ventilation hole we'd left, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of Karen attempting diplomacy through clenched teeth. "Hello? Hello? I need to come out now. This is very serious. I may sue." I tapped gently on the brick wall and replied, "Good morning, sunshine. How was your stay at Chateau Trespass?" At first, she tried the legal tone. "I demand to be released immediately. This is unlawful confinement. You're violating so many codes." Then came the guilt trip. "I could have a medical condition. What if I faint in here? You'll be liable." Then finally, the threat. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." I responded to none of it. I didn't have to. The beauty of the wall was that it removed the need for dialogue. She wanted to stay. Now she could stay in peace and solitude, like a monk in a temple made of bad decisions. While Karen ranted from behind the bricks, I got to work solidifying my defense. I knew this wasn't going to stay a funny prank between me and Dave for long. HOA Karen was the kind of person who didn't lose quietly. She'd already left voicemails for half the board members. And knowing her, she'd twisted the story to make it sound like I dragged her into a bunker and locked her up like a Bond villain. So, I started collecting all the receipts. The security footage clearly showed her entering the workshop uninvited. It showed me asking her multiple times to leave. It even captured her waving off my property deed like it was a grocery list. Everything was time-stamped, stored on cloud backups, and ready for presentation. I called Dave, who was still laughing about the whole thing, and told him to come by later in case we needed to remove the wall under pressure. He said he'd bring a cooler of beers and lawn chairs, just in case it turned into a full-on HOA showdown. In the meantime, I printed off 3 copies of my deed, a copy of the property lines from the county assessor, and the building permits dating back to my grandfather. My workshop was not HOA property. Not now, not ever. And I was going to make sure that fact was burned into every HOA document from here to the end of time. Around mid-morning, Karen went quiet. I figured she was finally using her phone to call for backup. Sure enough, by noon I saw a car pull up. Then another. And then the worst-case scenario. A black and white cruiser rolled to a stop just outside the gate. 2 officers stepped out, both looking equal parts curious and tired. I walked up to greet them, coffee still in hand. One of them, Officer Briggs, looked like he'd already had a run-in or 2 with Karen. He nodded and said, "You must be the guy with the cement mixer." I smiled and said, "Technically it was my buddy's cement mixer, but yeah, that's me." They asked if there was someone inside. I told them yes, and gave a very calm, very honest rundown of how she'd trespassed, refused to leave, and then claimed she had rights to the property. I handed over the deed, the survey, and a flash drive with the footage. The second officer, a younger guy named Ramirez, watched a few clips on his tablet and raised his eyebrows. "You built a whole wall around her?" I nodded. Thought it was poetic. The officers exchanged a look, clearly trying not to laugh. Briggs sighed and said, "All right, we'll need to check on her, make sure she's okay. But based on what we're seeing here, she may be the one in trouble." We knocked a few bricks loose near the ventilation slot, just enough to hand her a bottle of water and check that she wasn't hyperventilating. She was fine. Pissed, red-faced, and ready to sue, but physically fine. They escorted her out through the side entrance, which I'd left open the whole time just in case things went sideways. Karen didn't even look at me as she stormed off, iPad clutched like a weapon, muttering something about legal action and reputational damage. I thanked the officers, who chuckled on their way back to the car. Briggs said, "You'd be amazed how often we deal with her. You might have just set a new record, though." Once they were gone, Dave pulled up in his truck, saw the missing bricks, and shouted, "Aw man, you let her out already?" I told him not to worry. The real fun was just getting started. We patched up the hole, this time with a temporary board in case we needed access again. I didn't want to seal anything until I knew Karen wouldn't try another stunt. And believe me, I knew she would. I spent the rest of the day prepping the workshop for fallout. I backed up every document. I even set up a website with a simple page titled The Workshop Saga. Just in case. I knew Karen. She thrived on escalation. If she couldn't win with intimidation, she'd move to policy. If policy failed, she'd pivot to public opinion. So I beat her to it. By the time the sun went down, the story had already spread. Someone on the HOA board had leaked a screenshot from the security feed, showing Karen snoozing in the recliner with bricks going up behind her. It got picked up by a local Facebook group. Then a neighborhood Instagram page. Then Reddit. People were losing their minds. Comments ranged from "that guy deserves a medal" to "I've never wanted to build a wall more in my life." A few people offered to bring bricks just for fun. The hashtag #WorkshopKaren started trending in the local area. Karen, naturally, did not take this well. The next morning, she posted a 700-word rant on Nextdoor accusing me of kidnapping, vandalism, and psychological warfare. She called it an attack on the integrity of the HOA. She claimed I used emotional manipulation and architectural aggression. My favorite line was, "He weaponized bricks against a woman just doing her duty." I screenshotted the whole thing and added it to the website. That evening, an emergency HOA meeting was announced. I wasn't invited, of course, but I knew exactly what they were discussing. Damage control. How to spin the story. How to stop the leak. How to figure out whether they could still claim my property as part of the community space without looking like lunatic. But none of that mattered, because the next card I played was going to flip the board entirely. I went into the back of the workshop, past the old tool cabinets, and opened a locked drawer that held a folder I'd been waiting to use for just the right occasion. Inside were the closing papers on the adjacent lot, the one directly behind the HOA office building. I had quietly purchased it 6 months ago, just before the HOA renewed its charter. And I'd recently discovered something interesting. The HOA's server room, copier, and records room were built partially over the property line, onto my new lot. So while Karen was out there throwing tantrums and drafting lawsuits, I was sitting on the deed that gave me ownership over the foundation of their entire bureaucracy. I didn't plan to weaponize it just yet, but I made a copy of the paperwork and slipped it into a new folder marked Phase 2. Karen thought she was done with me. She had no idea she was just getting started. And next time, there wouldn't be any walls, just leverage. Real, crushing, ironclad leverage. But first, I was going to let her dig herself a little deeper. Karen didn't show her face for 2 full days after her dramatic escape from the brick embrace of my workshop. I figured she was either licking her wounds or trying to find a legal loophole she could wriggle through like a bureaucratic ferret. I was wrong. She was doing both, and also building a narrative. On day 3, I received a knock at my front door that didn't sound like a neighbor dropping off banana bread. It was sharp, clipped, and full of purpose. I opened it to find 2 people in buttoned-up business attire holding clipboards and wearing expressions like they were about to audit my soul. The woman introduced herself as a representative from the HOA's Legal Advisory Committee. The man said nothing but started scribbling notes as he looked past me into my house. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, and waited. They informed me that the HOA had filed an internal report citing me for obstruction of community access, inappropriate use of private space for personal confinement, and endangerment of a board member. I almost laughed out loud. Apparently Karen had managed to turn her 3-hour nap in my recliner into a full-on hostage situation. She claimed I had locked her inside against her will with no access to food, water, or ventilation, conveniently omitting the multiple bottles of water, the snacks in the emergency kit, and the 6 security cameras recording every inch of her tantrum. When I offered to show the footage to the committee members, they declined and said the matter was already under review. That's when I realized the HOA wasn't just backing Karen, they were afraid of her. The kicker came at the end of the visit. The woman handed me an envelope and said, "This is a notice of intent to annex." According to her, the HOA was moving forward with plans to absorb my property into the community jurisdiction, pending vote and land reassessment. I took the envelope, stared at it for a moment, then smiled. They'd just handed me the rope they were going to hang themselves with. I thanked them politely, closed the door, and went straight to my office. Inside that envelope was a letter so laughably toothless it could have been written in crayon. It was filled with vague legal language, incorrectly cited statutes, and absolutely no signatures from any governing body that mattered. Still, it was proof that Karen had managed to pull the rest of the board into her delusion. That meant they were officially playing offense, which was perfect because I was ready to go nuclear. Before I lit the fuse, I needed one final check on my flank. I called my cousin Danny, who happened to be a land use attorney. She was the kind of person who could find loopholes in a submarine manual and make them airtight. I sent her scans of the annexation notice, my property deeds, the HOA charter, and the footage from the incident. She called me back 20 minutes later laughing so hard she could barely breathe. She confirmed what I suspected. The HOA had no authority to annex anything without county approval, and their charter specifically excluded properties built before 1985 that hadn't opted in. Mine was built in 1978 and had never signed a single HOA agreement. Karen's entire plan was built on fantasy. But Danny also noticed something else. She told me to check the coordinates of the HOA's office building against the plat map for the lot next door. I did. And just like I remembered, about 15 feet of their building, The back wall, the server room, and the entire HVAC unit sat on the lot I had quietly purchased. Danny nearly choked laughing again. She said if I really wanted to end this, I could serve them with a cease and desist and force them to vacate the part of their office encroaching on my land. I told her I wanted to do something even better. I wanted to go public. It started with a flyer. I printed 50 copies and taped them up at every local coffee shop, gas station, and community bulletin board I could find. The title said, "Did the HOA try to annex your property? Read this." Below was a link to the website I'd created, now updated with new documents, timelines, and Karen's next-door rant immortalized forever. The video footage was front and center, along with a red highlighted portion of the HOA charter proving they were violating their own bylaws. But the real gem was the satellite image showing the HOA building overlapping onto my land, complete with color-coded lines and a giant arrow pointing to the server room labeled illegal occupation. Within 48 hours, the story blew up. Local blogs picked it up. Neighborhood parents started posting it on Facebook. A retired judge who lived 2 streets over emailed me directly and said, "If they so much as breathe another word about annexation, I'll see them in court pro bono." But the best part came on a rainy Thursday morning when Karen herself returned to my property, this time with a camera crew. I was sipping coffee on my porch when I saw her marching up the walkway in a bright red blazer like she was hosting an infomercial. Behind her were 2 men carrying boom mics and a woman holding a DSLR camera. Karen walked right up to my steps and began talking to the camera, loudly and confidently. She claimed I had created an unsafe environment, that I was targeting her personally, and that I was inciting anti-HOA sentiment across the neighborhood. I waited until she paused, then stood up and asked her camerawoman if they wanted better lighting. The woman gave me a nervous laugh. Karen turned redder than her blazer. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply walked over to the side gate and taped a laminated copy of the county plat map and my deed to the fence. Then I held up a laminated sign that read, "I own the land under your server room." The camerawoman zoomed in on it without hesitation. Karen tried to block the shot, but it was too late. By the time she stormed off again, the footage was already circulating online. Someone edited it with dramatic music and labeled it "HOA Boss Gets Schooled on Her Own Front Lawn." That night, the HOA held another emergency meeting, and this time, the minutes were leaked. The notes revealed that half the board members were ready to remove Karen from her position. Apparently several of them had warned her not to escalate the conflict with me and were now scrambling to distance themselves. One anonymous board member even sent me an email thanking me for exposing the power grab, saying the HOA had become more about fear and fines than community upkeep. That email came with attachments. Specifically, internal emails from Karen's account showing that she had been actively trying to pressure the board into revising the HOA map to include my property, without notifying me. She even referred to it as the workshop acquisition plan. I didn't release the emails right away. I wanted to wait. Let them stew. Let Karen keep spinning her version while the real story quietly gained traction. I made one final update to the website. A countdown timer labeled Property Truth Bomb incoming. I set it to expire at the exact hour of the next official HOA town hall meeting. And just to be sure it got attention, I put flyers under every HOA member's windshield. No threats. No insults. Just facts. Karen had declared war with bureaucracy. I was just better at it. As the timer ticked down, the entire neighborhood buzzed with speculation. People whispered at the farmers. The town hall meeting was scheduled for 6 in the evening on a Friday, a time deliberately chosen by the HOA to ensure low turnout. They figured people would be too busy unwinding from the week, heading to dinner, or collapsing on their couches to show up and engage in yet another dry session about shrub heights and mailbox paint. But this time, the parking lot was full an hour before the doors opened. The room was packed to the walls, people standing along the sides, others sitting cross-legged on the floor just to get a glimpse of what they all believed would be the final episode of the Karen saga. The timer on my website had created a buzz none of the HOA board had anticipated. Even the mayor's assistant was spotted in the back row, phone in hand, recording. I walked in casually, a folder under my arm and a travel mug of coffee in my hand. I nodded to a few neighbors who gave me thumbs-ups and knowing smirks. Karen was already seated at the head of the table, flanked by the board members who looked more like they were being held hostage than actively participating. She wore a pale pink blazer this time, clearly an attempt to appear softer and more professional than the red firetruck monstrosity she'd chosen during her failed press stunt. Her smile was tight, forced. She saw me enter and flinched just slightly. That alone made the trip worth it. The meeting began like any other. A few perfunctory notes were read, budget updates were shared, and then Karen launched into a speech that was so thick with spin, it could have doubled as a washing machine cycle. She spoke of community unity, respect for shared spaces, and the need to update jurisdictional boundaries to ensure fairness for all. She never mentioned my name, never referenced the workshop incident directly, but everyone in the room knew exactly who and what she was talking about. She wrapped it up by calling for a board vote to approve the annexation of adjacent lots that currently fall into jurisdictional ambiguity, a phrase so vague it could have been pulled from a fortune cookie. The board shifted uncomfortably. A couple members looked at their shoes. One man, Steve, actually coughed just to break the silence. Karen looked around expectantly, clearly waiting for someone to second her motion. Before anyone could speak, I raised my hand. The room turned to me like I'd just stood up in church and challenged the preacher to a debate. Karen tried to ignore me, but the board chair reluctantly acknowledged me. I stepped forward and placed the folder on the table. Before you vote on annexing land that doesn't belong to you, I think it's only fair that you have the facts. I handed out copies of the documents to each board member and held up the county-approved plat map. My voice was calm, measured, and loud enough for everyone to hear. This map clearly shows that my workshop sits entirely outside HOA jurisdiction. I then passed around the deed, dated and notarized, with no HOA liens, clauses, or references. Then I handed them the satellite photos showing the HOA building encroaching 15 feet onto the lot I had purchased. You want to annex my land, but technically, your HVAC system is squatting on mine. Karen tried to cut in. She accused me of theatrics, of trying to derail a legitimate discussion with grandstanding. I didn't respond. Instead, I handed the final set of documents to the board chair. Emails from Karen's account detailing her plan to expand the HOA's footprint by subtly altering public records and pushing quiet votes through during meetings with low attendance. One email referred to me as a problematic landholder. Another described the workshop as a future storage facility, suggesting they repurpose it once annexed. The room went quiet. You could hear the buzz of the fluorescent lights above, and the sound of someone's water bottle clinking on the tile floor. Steve, the board member who had been coughing earlier, flipped through the pages and then looked up, stunned. He turned to Karen and asked flat out if she had written those emails. She tried to dodge, said the emails had been taken out of context, that she had merely been brainstorming ideas. But by then, no one was buying it. The audience murmured louder and louder until the board chair slammed his gavel and called for order. A motion was made right then and there by one of the younger board members to suspend the annexation vote and open an internal investigation into Karen's conduct. Another board member added a motion to temporarily suspend Karen from her duties pending that investigation. A vote was taken, and for the first time in recent memory, Karen didn't have the numbers. The result was 5 in favor, 2 against, and 1 abstention. Karen's smile vanished completely. Her face turned the shade of an undercooked beet. She didn't even wait for the meeting to end. She grabbed her purse and stomped out of the room, brushing past me without making eye contact. The meeting adjourned shortly after. People spilled into the parking lot buzzing with conversation, some congratulating me, others shaking their heads at how wild everything had gotten. I didn't say much. I nodded, thanked people for coming, and made my way home. That night, I updated the website again. The top of the page now read, "Workshop secured. HOA contained." Beneath it, I posted a timeline of the events, every document used, and a video recap narrated in a calm voice, ending with a quote from the HOA charter about respecting private property. Over the next few days, the fallout spread like wildfire. Karen's removal became the talk of the town. Several news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a case of local overreach and grassroots resistance. Memes flooded the internet. Someone photoshopped Karen's face onto a medieval castle wall with the caption, "Fortified but not justified." The video from the town hall got more than 1 million views in a week. Even my cousin Danny started getting calls from people asking her to represent them in fights against their own HOA. She joked that we should start a business called Brick and Law. But the most satisfying moment came quietly. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from a board member who had voted in my favor. Inside was a simple note that read, "Thank you for standing up when the rest of us were too scared to. We're fixing things now." There was also a gift card to the hardware store. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped it. I kept working in my shop every day, the same way I always had. The wall we built was long gone, but its story remained, etched into the memory of the neighborhood. Kids would ride by on bikes and ask if that was the place where the lady got walled in. I'd just nod and say, sort of. The real wall was paper thin. It was just made of bylaws, lies, and a little too much confidence. Karen didn't vanish entirely. She kept a low profile for a while, then quietly moved to another neighborhood across town. Word had it she tried joining another HOA board, but was politely told there were no open positions. It seemed her reputation had followed her, like a tail she couldn't cut loose. As for the rest of us, life settled down. The HOA became a lot more transparent, the meetings better attended, and the nonsense fines stopped completely. It had been 3 weeks since the town hall meeting that cracked the Karen fortress wide open, and life in the neighborhood was finally starting to feel normal again. The air felt lighter, conversations no longer carried the tense undercurrent of HOA dread, and for the first time in years, people actually smiled at each other during their evening walks. The board, now under new leadership, had publicly apologized for their role in the attempted annexation scheme, citing confusion, pressure, and, as one of them awkwardly put it, an overwhelming exposure to Karen. They repealed several ridiculous regulations, erased pending fines, and even announced an open-door policy for future decision-making. In a strange way, Karen's tyranny had forced a community reset. But despite the calm, I wasn't done yet. There was still one loose end, one final nail to hammer down, and I intended to drive it in so deep it would echo through every future HOA meeting for the next decade. I waited for just the right moment. Karen, though disgraced, had not gone fully silent. She had slithered back into her little echo chamber, trying to rewrite the story online in small, petty bursts. On niche forums and carefully moderated comment threads, she painted herself as the victim of cyberbullying, claiming I had rallied a mob to destroy her reputation and legacy. Of course, she never mentioned trespassing, the emails, or the ridiculous power play that started it all. She just couldn't let it go. And that was fine with me, because it meant I had one last opportunity to make the lesson permanent. I contacted the local news station that had previously covered the story and offered them something exclusive. They jumped on it immediately. The story had already brought them record engagement, and the chance to run a follow-up with new evidence and a bigger payoff was like throwing meat to wolves. I sent them the full, unedited email thread, every message Karen had sent regarding the secret annexation plan, every lie she told the board, every instruction she'd issued to manipulate the boundaries and reclassify private land as community property. I made sure nothing was taken out of context, and I also included a few anonymous testimonies from board members who had admitted to being pressured or intimidated by her during her reign. The piece aired on a Thursday evening, right in the middle of the primetime slot. It was titled The HOA Power Grab: Secrets Behind the Workshop Wall. They led with drone footage of my workshop, then cut to clips from the town hall, overlays of the emails, and interviews with residents who'd had their own run-ins with Karen. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone she'd wronged, people fined for imaginary violations, bullied into silence, or forced to comply with bogus codes just to avoid confrontation. The broadcast ended with a simple question posed by the anchor: who protects the community when the rules are used as weapons? By the next morning, the fallout had reached every corner of town. Karen's attempt to rehabilitate her image crumbled completely. She was removed from every community forum she hadn't already been banned from. Her remaining allies, now radioactive by association, either resigned from the HOA or issued frantic public apologies. The property across town where she'd relocated sent her a formal warning, advising her not to interfere with any association matters unless she was an elected official, which, by then, was never going to happen again. Karen had become a walking cautionary tale. Still, I wasn't bitter. Not really. The whole ordeal had become something more than revenge. It had turned into a very public case study on what happens when ego meets resistance. And the truth was, I didn't hate Karen. I pitied her. She had become so addicted to control that she couldn't see a community as a collection of individuals. To her, it was a chessboard. But she forgot one important rule: the pawns talk. And when they talk enough, even the queen can fall. I decided to commemorate the entire saga with something tangible. Something absurd, symbolic, and impossible to ignore. So I took the first brick we'd used in the wall, still sitting in the back of my shop, mortar bits clinging to its sides, and mounted it on a wooden plaque. Below it, I engraved a metal plate that read, "In grateful memory of HOA Karen's temporary residence. May she never return." I hung it above the workshop door, right where she had once insisted I was violating shared space regulations. Every visitor who walked in laughed when they saw it. Even the UPS guy took a selfie with it one day and asked if he could post it. I said go right ahead. As a final act of closure, I threw a barbecue. Not just any barbecue. This was a full-on community cookout. I invited every neighbor within 10 blocks, rented a bounce house for the kids, set up tables with fresh lemonade, and even brought in a local band to play in the backyard. The whole thing was themed around freedom from HOA tyranny. I called it Workshop Independence Day. Dave, naturally, was in charge of the grill. He showed up in an apron that read brick by brick and spent the entire afternoon retelling the wall story to anyone who asked. People brought dishes, shared stories, and laughed about their own ridiculous HOA experiences. One woman told me she had once been fined for leaving her Christmas lights up past January 2nd. Another man said he was told to repaint his fence because it was 2 shades too brown. For the first time, neighbors who had once only waved in passing were having real conversations. We bonded over the shared relief of not being under a microscope anymore. It felt less like a barbecue and more like the restoration of common sense. As the sun set and the last of the burgers were eaten, I stood up and thanked everyone for coming. I told them that while the workshop wall might have been built with bricks, the real foundation of this whole story was the power of people saying no. No to nonsense. No to overreach. No to fear of speaking up. The crowd clapped, laughed, and someone yelled out, "Long live the workshop." It was cheesy, but in that moment it felt earned. That night, after everyone had gone home and the yard was littered with folding chairs and empty lemonade cups, I sat alone on the porch with a glass of scotch. I looked over at the workshop, its lights still on, humming softly like a quiet engine of resilience. It had always been my place of peace, my escape from the noise of the world. I never imagined it would become the center of a neighborhood rebellion. But sometimes the fight finds you whether you want it or not. The trick is choosing how you respond. I chose bricks, and as strange as it sounded, they had given me more than just a wall. They gave me back my space, my community, and the absolute certainty that no clipboard-wielding tyrant would ever walk through my door again without an invitation. In the weeks that followed, things finally settled into a new rhythm. The HOA stopped bothering people. The board meetings turned from courtroom dramas into polite discussions about landscaping budgets and neighborhood watch schedules. People volunteered for cleanup days, helped repaint fences, and mowed lawns together. It was everything an HOA was supposed to be: helpful, supportive, invisible when needed. I didn't attend every meeting, but I was always invited, always welcome. And that was enough.